Okay, this one is going to be in honor of my brother-in-law, Josh. He passed away recently at age 51. And he was truly the life of the party. So I'm going to call this life of the party. And celebrate him, really. But he said something that his wife reported at his funeral that I think is fascinating. And it's similar to something I've long felt, what I call my critique of religion. And there's only one. Okay? I mean, critique, at least in the way it's been presented to us. And what Josh said, or what Kelly said Josh said, when she asked him what his goal in life was, he said, to have fun. Right? Pretty good goal, to have fun. She, of course, joked she was a little disappointed in that. She was expecting maybe something more grand. But the precision of that is spot on as it connects to my critique of religion. Because I've actually said for a long time, my number one criticism of religion is it's not fun enough. Okay? It's not simple enough. It seems like such work. It's so hard. It's cumbersome. It's a burden. And there's a lot of stuff that happens in our lives that comes across that way. And yet we need to have more fun. If only religion and spirituality were made more fun, if we would just celebrate life more, and if we would talk about it that way and not make it such a burden, it would be a lot easier to do. And it'd be a lot easier to pull kids in as well, right? And so I didn't know that that's what he said his goal in life was. It was easy to see in the way he lived his life that having fun was his goal. That was clear. That's what he was always doing for sure. But it's also exactly what's needed in spirituality and in religions, okay? So we're going to try to have fun with something today, at least a little bit of fun. Look at it a little different and why we can have more fun when it comes to perhaps the biggest, most difficult topic ever, which is death. And at Josh's funeral, it was an overflow crowd. I was joking with some family members and friends that we're going to have to combine our funerals, we're all to die at the same time, so we could have as many people as Josh had there. And I also joke that if your Wi-Fi or the internet glitched last week, it was because there was a throng of people flooding Facebook to give their love and adulation for what Josh's life was all about to them, right? And so he crashed the internet a little bit. Okay? So he was a fun guy. We're going to have a little bit more fun in his honor today by looking at death a little bit differently. So I want to start with a quick review for some people who've never seen me talk about this or talk about spirituality at all before. With this little drawing up here, it's always about this, and life is always about this. Do you think of yourself as a spiritual being or as a physical being? I draw it as this blob thing here. That's the spirit. And this physical thing, stick figure, which we know is the body. All teachings and all philosophies that are high-end, most respected philosophies say the same thing. It's the spirit that's real. The body is an illusion. Albert Einstein proved that 100 years ago, and colleagues, that the physical world is an illusion. It's not what we think it is. The body, which we think of as flesh, I like to use the equals mc squared equation. If you take the equals mc squared and you put the c squared under the e, because that's math and you can do that. If you take energy and you slow it down, mass shows up. Now just swap out the e for spirit. If you slow down spirit, your body shows up. I'm literally looking at your spirits right now. And if I think of you as body first, I'm actually a sinner. We're going to talk about that later. And the mistake we make is when we see each other physically first. What we're supposed to do is see each other spiritually. And that, to me, is just what Einstein's most famous equation actually proves, okay? Because our physical bodies are our spirits slowed down. And we understand this with water quite simply. In liquid form, H2O is the same thing as in solid form, and when it becomes ice, it's still H2O. It's the same thing slowed down. Quite literally, when you slow down the molecules of H2O, it hardens, it freezes. And so H2O is the same thing. Einstein, in his equals mc squared, he said different manifestations of the same thing. That means our bodies are not what we are. It's a secondary feature of what we are. The spirit is what we are. As Jesus says in John 6:63, the spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. And so if we look at each other and we think of each other as physical bodies, we're missing the mark. That's actually what sinning means. To see the world in a physical way primarily, okay? And so we either think of ourselves as spiritual beings, which is the real world, or we think of ourselves as physical beings, which is the illusion. And that's spiritual philosophy and quantum physics, okay? So Romans 5:3 says we rejoice in our sufferings. When we do funerals, and we all experience them, there's crying, and that's sadness, and that makes sense, because it is sad to watch people transition or to know that that's happened. But why is Paul saying we need to rejoice in our sufferings? This isn't about not suffering, because we're all going to suffer. We're all going to go through pain, but we can add an element of celebration to it. And it's not necessarily to make it go away, although it might. None of us likes to suffer. But we want to rejoice in it. We have to take the adversities we experience and add an element to it. That's what spirituality is for. It changes it when you look at it different. It wakes us up in many different ways, okay? So that's a pretty big deal, and there's not many more sufferings than funerals. And we've all gone through that. We know what that means. But when we don't add a level of rejoicing to it, that's when we end up grief-stricken. And then it becomes dysfunctional, and we look at death as something different than what it is. It is dysfunctional because we're off the mark. In fact, we're sinning when we get too deep into that for too long. It doesn't need to be. I'm a big fan of the proper interpretation of Jesus weeping over the death of Lazarus. His spiritual death is the problem, okay? But even if it was the physical death, there can be a weeping. And what was he weeping for? The sadness and the grief that everyone is experiencing. It's sad to watch people be grief-stricken over something that is a natural process. And it doesn't have to be like that. It can be different. So, something back to the link that I saw when Josh said that about life should be, he wants to have fun. I think of mental health and spirituality along those lines in a very important way. I like to make it into a little bit more of a game, to think of it in terms of not good and bad. Think of it in terms of challenges and opportunities, like games are. And here I have this little drawing. Josh was a track coach, so I have a drawing of a person doing a high jump. And if the bar of our potential, our spiritual potential, is this bar, we need to clear it. If we don't clear that bar, that gap is what we feel as depression. In a minute, I'm going to show you the science of this, something that I think is really cool, that it absolutely works like this. But most of us, when we're struggling, especially when it comes to a grief over a funeral, it's because we're not looking at it quite right. That's quite normal to do. We all do this at various times, okay? But to look at death properly is to see no death at all. And if we look at death too specifically and focus on that aspect of it, that's when we're going to be more grief-stricken. That's also when depression's going to show up. When we truly understand what death is, we're clearing the bar. Now, this applies to every aspect of our being. When we have spiritual potential for something, let's say forgiveness or patience, and we don't do those things, and we have a gap because we're not clearing that bar, of course we're going to be a little more down. And often that manifests as depression, and that can go into many different directions. When we only look at ourselves as a body, and we evaluate ourselves as a body in all the physical ways, we are missing the mark because we're not a body. We're spiritual beings that has a body. And if we overdo it on the physical being, if we over-attend to it or we attach to it too strongly, then we start to develop mental health issues. But when we loosen that up and go towards the spiritual direction, because it's not about what you look like or your age or your political affiliation, sexual orientation, religion, your race, any of those things, your gender. It's not about any of those things. That's physical stuff. The spiritual aspect of things is learning the virtues despite those things or in spite of those things, okay? Because we all argue about that stuff. When we clear the bar, it's because we're being spiritual, and that's how we make depression go away. So there's a brain science study that I saw recently that explains this perfectly. They looked at the brains of very depressed people, and they found that the cortex of the brain had thinned or atrophied in 4 different regions of the brain for very depressed people. It got thinner, right? And they can see this when they scan the brain. Then they looked at very spiritual people, okay? People who were loaded with these virtues. And guess what they had? A thickening of the cortex in exactly those same areas of the brain. And so depression, which starts to change the brain, thins the cortex, the antidote is being spiritual. And so if you look at something wrong, for example, death, and you think of it as bad in the end, potentially something horrible like hell, like we get taught a lot, that sounds pretty bad. That's also pretty depressing, and it's also not true. But if we look at that, and that's the only way we look at that, yeah, sure enough, we're going to thin the cortex of our brains a little bit. And then we're going to end up a little bit more depressed. The antidote comes in the form of spirituality, looking at it the right way, okay? So now I'm going to show you the right way, coming from the Course in Miracles, okay? Sometimes when I start reading this book, I could end up reading the whole thing. It's 1,500 pages. So I better be careful there, okay? So I'm going to try to read just 2 or 3 paragraphs. But Course in Miracles addresses death so beautifully. And starting with this first line here in lesson 163, there is no death. That's pretty clear, right? We've been taught death is the end, and we think of it that way. And since we've all been taught, we all go with the flow on that, we see such a sharp distinction between what we think is life, physical, and what we think is death, end of physical life. But again, that's not it. You're a spiritual being. Your body's just an extension of that. The body might die, but good news, that's not you. Here's how Miracles describes it in the section called What is Death? Death is the central dream from which all illusions stem. Is it not madness to think of life as being born, aging, losing vitality, and dying in the end? In the one fixed, unchangeable belief of this world is that all things are born into it, just die. This is regarded as the way of nature, not to be raised to question, but to be accepted as the natural law of life. The cyclical, changing and unsure, the undependable and the unsteady, waxing and waning in a certain way upon a certain path. All of this is taken as the will of God, and no one asks if a benign creator could will this. In this perception of the universe as God created it, it would be impossible to think of him as loving, for who has decreed that all things pass away, ending in dust and disappointment and despair, can be but feared. He holds your little life in his hand by a thread, ready to break it off without regret or care, perhaps today. The reality of death is firmly rooted in the belief that God's children are our bodies. If God created these bodies, death would indeed be real, but God would not be loving. There is no point at which the contrast between the perception of the real world and of the world of illusions becomes more sharply evident. That means when we look at ourselves as bodies and we describe death as the end of the body, and that means the person died, we're missing the point. And Miracles nails it. There is nothing that makes our false perception of the world more clear than our perceptions of death. And now we're back to this. What's real? What's an illusion? And if we keep looking at the world as a physical place primarily, we're in the illusion. It's also sinning. That's super important. A sin is a misperception of life as physical. Miracles is about that. The origin of the word sin is indeed to miss the mark. Sinning isn't about all the physical stuff. And we tend to sin when we focus on ourselves as physical, but it's not the type of sin that we're always perceiving. Something like stealing your neighbor's TV and doing drugs and all those bad things. I'm not saying those are good. I'm just saying it's not sinning. And people make that mistake all the time because that's what we get taught. The original sin is when we started to think of ourselves as physical. That's it. And then we started to identify that way. And then I started to identify with each other that way. Then we started to label everything. That's the original sin. It's also the only sin. It's what we have to get over. It has many different branches coming from it, a lot of different sins, and it's usually judgment of other, and the fear and the shame and the guilt of all the stuff that goes along with our bodies and other people's bodies. So that's the sin. So to pull it into a nice, perfect little drawing, I have this. And again, what I want people to be able to do is perceive this accurately, as simply as possible. We don't need to make it any more difficult than this little drawing here. It's simple. Here's Josh as a spiritual being, and he had a dream of himself in the physical. And I got birds and bunny because that's all the stick figure stuff I can draw. The real life is the spirit. It's dreaming the physical life. That's the dream we're all in. Once again, the word Buddha means to wake up. But man, it sure seems real, doesn't it? Like almost every other dream you have at night. Sure seems real. Seems solid too, except for it's not. It's a complete figment of your imagination when you have a dream at night. Well, this is the exact same thing. A spiritual being equals MC squared, slows down, descends into matter, takes on a physical body. That's like line 7 of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao gives you a physical body. Well, that's what's happened. Then we bit off the apple of good and evil, or bit off the tree of good and evil from the apple, and we started to perceive the world as a physical thing and as a physical place. And now we're disconnected from God. That's what it's all about. And so now we fall into the dream or the illusion, and we think this is the real place. And if we're obsessing about this as the real place, that's where all the suffering comes. That's where this depression, high jump comes into play, okay? When we misperceive sinning, we develop mental health issues. And again, this is all of us. No one's ever escaped this, okay? With perhaps the exception of Jesus. But because he was sinless after all. That just meant he knew what he was from the beginning. He knew he was a spiritual being from the beginning. Then he knew what he needed to do with that. Pretty much what we have to do too. The more you realize you're a spiritual being, the more we're supposed to share that with other people. That's what makes the suffering diminish. That's what makes it go away. It also brings about more rejoicing, okay? So I like to think of death as a lot more like this. Now imagine you went to bed at night and you had a dream and you stayed stuck in that dream. You can have some good points of the dream, some bad points, right? But if the dream goes away, what happens to you? Now inside the dream, for sure, the character disappears. Whatever you were in the dream. I literally had a dream that night where I was in war with my daughter. And I completely thought that made sense. You know, she's a 21-year-old girl. She probably had a tutu on and I wouldn't have noticed, right? Like, why she got a gun and a tutu on? And I'm like fighting a war. And I remember feeling the terror and the fear. And I'm telling you, because it was out at our old house where the people were coming up over the hill and they were looking to attack us. And to me, it made total sense somehow in my crazy, mental state of thinking it was real. And I felt the terror of being in that type of war situation. And I kept thinking the whole time, how do I get my daughter out of this? Right? Well, you know how? Waking up. And sure enough, that's what happened. When I woke up, I still had I went and told her too. I said, man, we were just fighting a war together, but we didn't get killed. Somehow we managed to survive. Well, our characters died as soon as my dream ended, right? So if Josh was having a dream of himself and he takes on a body equals mc squared, E divided by c squared equals m, his spirit slowed down. Now Jesus says, you are the light. Josh is the light. E is the light. Energy. Light is just visible energy. That's it. So it makes us see our spirits. That's what we're looking at here. And so the end of the dream is just the awakening to the true self again. So here I put a little smiley face on him. He's really a spiritual being. And he's in the real world. Okay? And this is the reality of what's going on. Okay? He transitioned. He woke up. He's in a higher state. Physics has tons of teachings on this. The various dimensions to reality. Right? We know we're not limited to just these three. Time is the fourth dimension, and what's beyond that? At least 7 others, according to the quantum physicists. It's not hard at all to see that this is just dimensional thinking. So the physical self can't die because it's just in a dream state, and it's not even real like we think it is. It is indeed just an illusion. So, a couple Bible teachings to back this up. 1 Corinthians 15:26 says, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Okay? Why is that? It's such a big hurdle, like the miracles text said. It's the central dream illusion that we are all having, that we think death is real, and everyone else thinks death is real, so we treat it as real. And then when it happens, we go, and then we have a hard time seeing it any other way, because my goodness, this place seems so real. Well, that's why it's the last enemy to overcome. What did Jesus show by his crucifixion? He overcame death. That's the last hurdle. And that's what he was teaching us. Remember, he came back a couple days later. Then he leaves again. The Eastern teachings are all about the process of reincarnation as well. The fact is, you can leave and come back. Krishna says, I appeared again in age after age. Okay, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. But for sure, it's an enemy when we think of this place as the end-all be-all, because it certainly isn't. Again, that's sinning. And then Luke 15:10, there is joy when one sinner repents. What's repenting? It literally means, it comes from the root word hamartia, which means to improve your aim. A sinner is someone who's looking at it wrong. A sinner is misperceiving. A repenter is someone who's perceiving correctly. And here we got religion making it all about you're good or bad, like it's a Santa Claus thing. And at Christmas, you'll get toys if you're good, okay? Meanwhile, Jesus' teaching is, no, you're all good, okay? In fact, you're all spirit. You just forgot that. But when you wake up and realize what you are, the resurrection happens to you. The Christ comes inside you, right? That's all redemption is. Going, oh, wait a minute. This is just a costume. This is a temporary me. The eternal me is the spiritual self. That's the redemption. And there's joy when that happens, okay? There's Josh back to the being the life of the party. We need more joy. Death is just waking up to the true self. That's it. This is the illusion. And for those of you out here who have not looked this up, go Google, is life an illusion? Or is physical reality an illusion? There's going to be billions of hits. This is all over the place. We need to teach this in first grade, in my opinion. And we need to talk about it more. Is death sad? Of course it is. But I'm a mental health therapist. Nobody uses heroin or drinks themselves to death over sadness. That's not it. There's nothing wrong with sadness. Normal human range of emotion. It's the grief. It's the depression. But it's also the fear and the shame and the guilt and all these negative emotions that happens when we're sinners because we look at ourselves physically. So there's joy when we overcome the sin. And the sin is seeing the world like the physical self becomes primary. Right? The redemption is seeing ourselves as spiritually. Okay? So we must destroy the enemy. That is indeed a celebration of life. And what's the best way to celebrate life? Be spirit and have fun while doing it.